election would be respected. The very strong starting point is that commitment has to be met by Fiji.
Let's confirm this. Every aspect to do with a free and open environment and conditions for which there needs to be an election were canvassed. But bear this in mind that we are not operating under a duly elected government in Fiji, something quite different, that there will not be an acceptance of the electoral process unless it's free, fair and open. That said, of course, we had raised the issue of the media freedom and our concern about that, but it does include the right to print in the Herald today a long article from the Human Rights Commissioner of Fiji, Shyster, which is dramatically and curiously wrong in every respect for the final 9 paragraphs. With respect, we talk about media freedom, let's be fair about the proper use of it.
So it's free as long as you like what's written?
No, I don't like rubbish being written when there's not one New Zealander who would ever argue that the electoral law of this country remotely represents what was in the Herald today by way of the Human Rights Commissioner from Fiji. That's what I don't like, and nor should you if you're going to be professional either.
What's the consequences on Fiji should it not meet the deadline next year?
We've not come to that stage yet, but I think it's an important situation that's here that countries need to be cautious about. It's a situation that's not a elected government in office. It's a military government, and you all know that. And I think for us, I'm an elected leader for Papua New Guinea. I don't know what goes through the mind of a military leader. It's hard to work on those times. So what the forum is trying to do is engage them in dialogue and in ways of influencing the way they are thinking coming out, because we're keeping to that agreement that the Commodore made in Tonga regarding the March 2009 election, and therefore that they will, as a military, respect what comes as a result of those elections. So we're keeping to that word of honor of the Commodore at the time, and we believe there is no reason for the Commodore to lie about it. We think and we hold to the fact that this was spoken to the prime ministers and leaders of the Pacific Island from countries. So we hold truly to that, and we hope that what is happening between now and then will lead us to a free and fair election in Fiji.
While Fiji's military government gave the foreign ministers a renewed commitment to hold free and fair elections before March 31, 2009, clearly the foreign ministers were yet to be convinced of the Commodore's sincerity. So Scoop sought the views of AUT University's Associate Professor David Roby, who is currently the Director of AUT's Pacific Media Centre. Professor Roby is a Fiji specialist, having taught at the University of South Pacific for many years. He also observed Fiji's coup culture up close.
Some views on that and a little bit more detail on some of the concerns.
Well, for a start, the regime, and let's call it that, and I think one of the things that news media is rather poor, and particularly in New Zealand, sort of always referring to this interim government. It's a military-backed regime. Let's be upfront with that. But it does have, it's really suffering from a poor media image. It's curious because the military only just a few years ago had a number of their staff going through journalism school and so on. But there hasn't been really the other side of the story, and that is the rather one-sided coverage by media in Fiji generally.
Are you saying that there are levels of acceptance here relating to the controls that are being imposed upon journalists in Fiji?
No, I'm saying that much of the media coverage in New Zealand has actually sort of blown up a lot of things out of proportion, relatively, globally. And not actually recognised. In fact, there's still considerable freedom. What's missing, I think, is the other side of the debate. I mean, like for example, the policies that this regime has been advocating. Ostensibly it came in on a groundswell against corruption, and yet the portrayal by the media in countries such as Australia and New Zealand and so on is that the Qarase government, the one ousted by Bainimarama, some paragon of democracy. That's a farce, because it was a corrupt regime, it was a racist regime. It cynically used the democratic processes and the legal processes to institute or institutionalise various forms of racism. And that was the government, the so-called democratic government, and that was only elected on the basis of fear after the previous George Speight coup. And that's the government that was sort of thrown out by the military regime.
Do you feel that there was an element of justification there for the military to jump across the constitutional divide and actually overthrow a government?
A lot of people in Fiji believe that. And even in the last stages when Qarase was fighting for a survival of his government, he actually went on record as sort of encouraging people to come out against Indo-Fijians, and that was so cynical. And so even in those stages, he was playing the race card. To his credit, Bainimarama, the military commander, and the military is essentially all indigenous Fijian anyway, came in trying to actually sort of set in process a move back to a fair and just multiracial and multicultural society. One point I'd like to make is that had the Qarase government stayed in power, it would have included members of the leaders of the previous coup, the George Speight, the collaborators and the plotters, and they would have taken key positions in Parliament.
If we look at the timeline between now and the end of March next year, what's your views on that? Do you feel it's able to, and at what cost if it doesn't?
I quite honestly don't believe that they can actually meet that roadmap. And so there'll be various pretexts and so on why that won't actually happen. For a start, the electoral system, where there's a big question about whether that can cope. And also, there were some of the objectives that the regime had in mind was to change the whole electoral system. And to my mind, that's one of the essential things that's needed in Fiji.
There are those who would argue that constitutional reform has to actually take place under a duly elected government, and that prior to, under a regime that's controlled by the military as such, that is not elected, then it has no place to actually embark on constitutional reform from a legislative point of view.
And that's a very strong argument. On the other hand, the regime was actually trying to put in some place and some steps towards that. So I don't believe that it can be forced and pressured too soon. Otherwise, the whole process is going to fall on its head.
What's your impression on Commodore Frank Bainimarama, and as to can he be held to his word on having free and fair elections by the end of March next year?
Well, I think fundamentally Bainimarama is actually quite a principled military commander. I think he sincerely believed when he staged the coup that it was absolutely in the interests of all the people of Fiji, rather than any particular section or even the military. But his background was that he was heavily traumatised by what happened with the George Speight coup in 2000 and the subsequent mutiny in the military that led to an attempt on his life. This has very much been part of his thinking ever since. I think that he'll take whatever steps that he thinks is necessary for the future of Fiji, and he won't be bullied or pushed by Australia or New Zealand or any other countries in the Pacific. He will take his own counsel.